Okay, so I only have one person here, but that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and get started because I don't have a lot of time. We're approaching the end of Pride Month, and unfortunately, I started late covering uh, this type of content. So, my book is Blaming on Drastic Manufacturing of Black Homophobia and Performative Masculinity. There's a lot of topics that I could have covered, but I don't know. I think I was covering other stuff, so I just sort of lost track of time. Now, I just watched this video yesterday where this was a black man talking about how basically homosexuality was pushed on the black community by the white community, that white people were the leaders of the rainbow, or I'm not sure exactly how he phrased it, but that's completely incorrect. In fact, the leader of the gay rights movement was a black man by the name of Bayard Rustin, who was pushing for LGBT rights back in the 1940s, well before Harvey Milk, who was he led Stonewall in 69. So yeah, the same person who led the Black Civil Rights Movement is the same person who led the Gay Rights Movement. There was always intersectionality. I'm not sure why people are getting history so wrong, but I'm going to try to debunk some of it with chapter 2 of my book, because he also said that homosexuality was taught by whites, and that they got that so wrong. Um, so here's chapter 2 of my book. Who taught you to hate yourself? Homophobia as a tool of white supremacy. Who taught you to hate yourself? Malcolm X posed this searing question to a crowd in Los Angeles in 1962, challenging Black Americans to examine the origins of their self-perception. Decades later, this question can be reframed to address a painful reality within our communities. Who taught Black people to hate gay people? The answer leads us back to the same systems of white supremacy that Malcolm X fought against. Colonial powers who understood that dividing the oppressed against themselves was the surest way to maintain control. Homophobia did not originate in Africa. It was imported, weaponized, and strategically deployed by European colonizers to dismantle the social fabrics of African societies. To understand this, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The violence we as Black gay men face within our own communities is not a reflection of African tradition. It's the residue of colonial domination. Homophobia is not just personal prejudice, it is a political tool wielded to fracture Black solidarity and maintain white supremacy. Before the ships arrived, before the missionaries preached, and before colonial laws were inked into existence, many African societies embraced a spectrum of sexuality and gender diversity. Colonizers, however, understood the power of division. They knew that the easiest way to control a people was to turn them against each other. And what better way to achieve that than by criminalizing a natural part of human existence, queerness, and convincing the oppressed that the oppression was their own idea. European colonial powers introduced strict gender binaries and heterosexual norms as part of their civilizing mission. They framed African societies as barbaric not just because of their skin, but because of their sexual and gender fluidity. The colonizers' message was clear. To be civilized, Africans had to reject what was already theirs, a culture that did not see queerness as a threat, but part of life's diverse expression. The first assault was cultural erasure. European missionaries and administrators didn't just introduce Christianity, they rewrote history. They portrayed same sex relationships and non binary identities as perversions, despite overwhelming evidence that these practices were integral to pre colonial African life. They demonized indigenous spiritual systems, many of which embrace gender nonconformity and saw queer individuals as possessing unique spiritual insight. Take the Yoruba of Nigeria, for example. In pre colonial Yoruba society, gender roles were flexible, and certain spiritual leaders known as the Baba Loa, women, Baba Loa, I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, um, often transcended binary gender expectations. Similarly, the Igbo, the practice of female husbands, women who took on male social roles and married other women, was an accepted social structure, not an anomaly. These practices were not secret or shameful, they were part of the social fabric. Yet, when European colonizers arrived, they labeled these practices as sinful, unnatural, and backward. They imposed Victorian morality through colonial education systems, religious conversion, and legal frameworks. They made African people believe that queerness was foreign, a Western import, when in fact the true import was homophobia. The colonial strategy of divide and conquer was not limited to physical domination, it was extended into the psyche. By criminalizing queerness, colonizers created an integral enemy within black communities. Suddenly, the queer brother, the gender nonconforming sister, the soft spoken boy, or the assertive girl became threats to community survival. Not because they inherently were, but because colonial systems made it so. Colonial authorities passed anti sodomy laws, many of which remain on the books across Africa and the Caribbean today, to institutionalize this division. They weaponized the idea that queerness was not just immoral but anti African. It is no coincidence that the harshest anti gay laws in African countries today mirror the penal codes drafted by British and French colonial administrators. The colonizers may have left, but the systems they built and the self hatred they cultivated remain. Consider Uganda's infamous Kill the Gays bill, championed not just by local leaders but fueled by American evangelical influence, a Western extension of colonial religious imperialism. When Black Americans support such legislation, it's not because homophobia is inherently Black. It's because colonial narratives taught us to police each other, to see queerness as a threat rather than a shared experience of marginalization. Thus, homophobia serves its ultimate purpose to keep us fighting each other instead of dismantling the system that oppresses us all. It's a distraction, a poison passed down through generations, disguised as tradition but rooted in white supremacy. Until we confront this reality, we remain pawns in a colonial game designed to rob us of our humanity and unity. One of the most insidious lies colonialism ever sold us is that homophobia is an authentic part of African culture. It is a lie so deeply entrenched that many of our people will fight to protect it, believing they are defending their heritage. But the truth is far less convenient. Homophobia is a colonial inheritance, a foreign ideology disguised as tradition. European colonizers understood that cultural domination powerful, was as powerful as military conquest. They didn't just steal land, they rewrote history, casting their values as universal and labeling indigenous practices as primitive. Queerness, which once existed openly across many African societies, became the prime target of this cultural assault. Colonizers reframed same sex intimacy and gender nonconformity as un African, a deviant threat to the Christian morality they imposed through schools, churches, and colonial law. The irony, of course, is that the very people who introduced homophobia now accuse Africa of being inherently intolerant. They erased our history and then blamed us for forgetting it. And the reason why is so important because I've had these discussions about civilization. I've gotten a lot of critiques from people about me being an anarchist, saying that without statism, without Western societies, I would not even have the right to be gay. This is completely incorrect. This is counterfactual. They did not liberate. Get, they want to act like they are the progressive people who civilized them and taught them to be tolerant of the LGBT community. It's the complete opposite. They are the ones who taught them to be homophobic in the first place, and now they want to take credit for something they didn't actually do. To dismantle the myth of traditional black homophobia, we must reclaim the truth. Pre-colonial Africa was rich with diverse expressions of gender and sexuality across the continent. Same-sex relations, gender nonconformity, and fluid social roles were not just tolerated, but often integrated into cultural, spiritual, and social life. Among the Zandi people of what is now South Sudan and the Central African Republic, same-sex relations were part of the social fabric. Young male warriors often entered mentorship relationships with older men, relationships that were both emotional and sexual. These bonds were not seen as shameful, but as a natural part of warrior culture. The Yoruba of Nigeria society was not rigidly defined. I mean, their gender was not rigidly defined. Certain spiritual roles, such as priest or the Orisha or Ye Oja, I'm butcher. I don't know how to pronounce all these African words. Um, were often filled by gender nonconforming individuals. Same-sex relationships existed within royal courts and religious practices, unburdened by the stigma that colonization would later impose. The Igbo of Nigeria, among the Igbo, the institution of female husbands disrupted Western notions of gender and sexuality. A woman could marry another woman, often for economic or social reasons and take on the role of a husband. These relations were not were not viewed through the lens of sexual deviance, but as practical, respected social arrangements. Um, Let me just clarify how. I don't know if I went in detail, but basically, if a sister had a brother who died, the eldest sister would basically take on the male role, and if he had wives, then his sister could actually become the man of the family and take on his wives. I know people don't know this shit. They think that I have sources cited, or you can just Google it. I'm not making any of this stuff up. People just don't know their own history. Among the Samburu people, same-sex intimacy was common within the context of warrior bonding. Young warriors often engaged in romantic and sexual relationships with each other, which were seen as strengthening community ties rather than threatening them. These practices weren't hidden or shameful. They were integrated into everyday life. The arrival of European colonizers didn't civilize African societies. They corrupted them with homophobia, imposing their rigid definitions of gender and sexuality through law, religion, and education. The transatlantic slave trade was not just about the physical capture and sale of African bodies. It was about the erasure of culture, the forced adoption of European ideologies, and the violent reshaping of African identity to fit within a white supremacist framework. Enslaved Africans were stripped of not only their freedom, but their understanding of gender and sexuality. On the plantations of the Americas, European slaveholders imposed their patriarchal, heteronormative structures on enslaved Africans. Queer expressions, once accepted and even celebrated in many African societies, were now framed as deviant, punishable by death, torture, or social ostracization. Enslaved Africans who had once known societies where same-sex relationships were part of community life were now told that such relationships were sinful, unnatural, and deserving of punishment. This indoctrination didn't end with emancipation. It seeped into the consciousness of Black communities across the diaspora, reinforced by colonial education systems and Christian churches. Homophobia became a weapon used not just by white oppressors, but within Black communities themselves. A tragic example of how colonial violence teaches the oppressed to police each other. The persistence of homophobia in Africa is deeply connected to systems of centralized control, colonial administrations, religious institutions, and modern nation states, as documented in extensive historical research. In contrast, many pre colonial African societies were decentralized, organized around kinship networks, clans, and community-based leadership, fostering more fluid understandings of identity and less rigid social hierarchies. Colonialism disrupted these indigenous structures through imposed centralized governance and penal codes that criminalized same-sex intimacy. These laws, as historian Mark Aprich demonstrates, were not rooted in African cultural values, but were transplanted from European legal frameworks, particularly British and French colonial statutes. The infamous sodomy laws that persist in many African countries today are direct remnants of colonial rule. For instance, Botswana's High Court, in overturning colonial era laws criminalizing homosexuality, acknowledged that these anti-sodomy laws are a British import developed without the consultation of local peoples. Without the institution of statism, laws, police, prisons, homophobia struggles to sustain itself. When contemporary Black leaders defend anti-gay laws as African, they, as Sylvian Tamale argues, unwittingly perpetuate colonial oppression. Research for the Nordic African Institute confirms that the roots of homophobia in African are deeply entwined with the legacy of colonial laws, the role of religion, and political homophobia, contributing to the false narrative of homosexuality being un-African. Historical records reveal that before European conquest, many African societies operated under decentralized systems rooted in kinship networks and local governance. Anthropological research has documented how these systems prioritize community well-being over rigid social hierarchies, allowing for more flexible understandings of gender and sexuality. While not all pre-colonial societies were entirely accepting of same-sex relationships, oral traditions and archaeological evidence suggest a far more complex and tolerant landscape than colonial narratives imply. Neville Hold's African Studies research demonstrates how colonialism disrupted this cultural pluralism through imposed centralized governance structures that mirror European hierarchical systems. Colonial administrators, viewing indigenous sexual practices as uncivilized, sought to correct them through legal and religious enforcement. These laws were not just about controlling sexuality, they were part of a broader strategy to regulate African bodies, cultures, and communities under colonial rule. The path to dismantling these oppressive legacies, as activist Bisi Alamani, gosh, contends, requires more than legal reform. It demands a cultural and ideological shift. Pre-colonial Igbo, Zulu, and Daigara cultures, as documented by anthropologist Rudolph Gudio, understood gender and sexual expression in fluid terms. Among the Buganda of Uganda, court histories record same-sex relationships not as deviance, but as part of the social fabric. This history makes it clear oppression is not inherent to African culture. It is a colonial imposition. And yet, legal systems rooted in colonial rule continue to enforce rigid hierarchies that criminalize queerness and reinforce systematic violence. This is why I support anarchy over statism, because statism, by its very nature, consolidates power into the hands of the few, inevitably leading to oppression. Liberation cannot come from the state, which exists to maintain control, but from the rejection of its authority and the reclamation, reclamation of self determination. To understand the roots of black homophobia, we must confront an uncomfortable reality. Christianity, as introduced to African societies through colonization and slavery, was not about spiritual salvation. It was about control. European missionaries did not arrive on African shores with Bibles out of benevolence. They came with a dual purpose: to conquer land, and minds. And in their mission to civilize, they brought not only European religion, but European prejudice, including a deep seated intolerance for queerness. Before colonization, African spiritual systems were more diverse and often accommodating of gender and sexual fluidity. But when European missionaries arrived, they declared these systems pagan, sinful, and primitive. The Bible became both a weapon and a shield used to justify colonial rule while demonizing indigenous practices, including same sex relationships and non binary identities. Forced conversions were commonplace. Enslaved Africans were baptized not just into Christianity, but into the moral codes of their captors. Codes that frame queerness as a sin and heterosexual patriarchy as divine order. This religious indoctrination wasn't just about faith, it was about reshaping African societies in the colonizer's image. And that image had no place for queer people. The colonial church didn't simply introduce Christianity to Africa, it weaponized scripture to uphold systems of oppression. Just as Bible verses were cherry picked to justify slavery, they were also used to condemn same sex relationships. Missionaries and colonial administrators latched on to passages like Leviticus 18:22, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind." It is an abomination while conveniently ignoring the broader context of African spirituality and social customs. But it wasn't just about the text, it was about who controlled the narrative. Europeans controlled the schools, the churches, and the legal system. They decided what counted as moral and what didn't. African traditions that embraced sexual diversity were cast aside as sinful, while Western patriarchal norms were elevated as God's will. This selective interpretation continues to shape black churches today. Many black Christians fiercely defend anti gay theology, unaware that the very doctrines they uphold were once tools of colonial domination. It's no coincidence that the most homophobic rhetoric often comes from churches rooted in colonial missionary traditions. These churches inherited not just Christian doctrine, but the colonizers' moral framework, one that sees queerness as a threat to order and control. Um, I just want y'all to know that many of these African cultures were not patriarchal, they were actually matriarchal. They didn't see femininity as weakness. They didn't disrespect women. They didn't disrespect men who displayed feminine qualities. They actually saw it as a strength. They saw it as a gift. And so that is part of the colonization. The demonizing of the feminine. I mean, I didn't address it in this chapter, but I did address that, and I guess I just addressed it in chapter 3, that which I've already gone over. Let me keep going. The black church the black church holds a complicated place in the history of black liberation. It was the heart of resistance against slavery, Jim Crow, and systemic racism, a sanctuary where black people found hope, solidarity, and strength. But it was also a place where colonial ideologies took root, including the belief that queerness was sinful and destructive. This contradiction is not accidental. During slavery, white slaveholders encouraged Christianity among the enslaved not to liberate them, but to pacify them. They preach obedience, submission, and the sanctity of heterosexual family structures, reinforcing patriarchal dominance. When enslaved Africans formed their own churches, they inherited these colonial frameworks, often without questioning their origins. I wonder why they wanted the slaves to be heterosexual. It doesn't take a rocket science to realize that they wanted you to be heterosexual so that you could produce more slaves. If you were homosexual, then you don't produce more slaves. So that's the reason why. So I'm not sure why people are not missing this glaring um, deduction that it was not for your self-interest, it was for their self-interest. They wanted you to procreate so that you could produce more slaves, and you're still doing it today. I just don't get it. I don't understand how these people are complaining about the system, yet they're willingly perpetuating the system through their own reproductive practices. As a result, the black churches became both a refuge and an enforcer of oppression. It fought for civil rights while preaching sermons that condemned queerness. It uplifted the community while ostracizing those who didn't fit neatly into heterosexual cisgender norms. The same pulpit that called for freedom from white supremacy also reinforced the very ideologies white supremacy introduced. The church didn't just preach homophobia from the pulpit, it facilitated community policing of gender expression and sexuality. Boys were conditioned to equate masculinity with dominance, strength, and heterosexuality. Any deviation from this norm, whether softness, emotional vulnerability, or attraction to other boys, was met with ridicule, shame, or violence. Girls, meanwhile, were warned that queerness undermined their desirability and value. The ideal black woman, according to colonial Christianity, was submissive, heterosexual, and dedicated to family life. Queerness disrupted this ideal, threatening not just personal morality, but the social order itself. I want you to understand the connection between homosexuality and anarchy. I do have a chapter in this book, but I don't think I'm going to have a chance to get to it. That homosexuality dismantles the state. It is an act of rebellion. This surveillance extended beyond the home and church into schools, workplaces, and community spaces. Queer black boys learned early that survival meant hiding, performing masculinity, and suppressing any expression that might expose them to ridicule or violence. And those who couldn't hide or refused to were labeled as outcasts, sinners, or threats to community respectability. The black church condemnation of homosexuality stands in stark contrast to its silence and on other forms of harm. While sermons rail against queerness, they often ignore or excuse domestic violence, sexual abuse, and other forms of exploitation within the community. This selective morality exposes the true purpose of religious homophobia: control, not righteousness. It's telling that the church often speaks of homosexuality as a sinful choice while ignoring the systemic conditions that shape black life: poverty, racism, police violence, and mass incarceration. Condemning queer people is easy, challenging white supremacy is not. And so the church becomes complicit in colonial oppression, upholding the very systems it claims to resist. But this complicity is not inevitable. Black churches have also been sites of radical resistance, embracing liberation theology and centering the fight for justice. The question is whether they will extend that fight to include queer black people or whether they will remain trapped in colonial ideologies that prioritize control over community. To understand how homophobia was imposed on African society, we must first examine what those societies looked like before colonialism. Unlike the rigid hierarchical structures introduced by European colonizers, many pre colonial African societies were decentralized, organized around kinship networks rather than centralized states. I know I'm being repetitive, but I have to because I'm debunking a lot of misguided preconceptions about what Africa was like. This decentralized structure fostered cultural diversity, social flexibility, and tolerance for difference, including differences in gender and sexuality. In these societies, identities was not policed by state institutions or religious authorities. Community well-being was prioritized over rigid conformity, and gender roles were often fluid, shaped by social function rather than biological sex. Sexuality was viewed in terms of relationships and responsibilities rather than sin and morality. There was no singular African understanding of sexuality because Africa itself has always been an incredibly diverse continent, home to thousands of ethnic groups, languages, and cultural practices. This diversity meant that many African societies embraced queerness not as an anomaly but as a natural expression of human existence. Relationships between two people of the same sex, non-binary gender identities, and flexible gender roles were seamlessly integrated into social and cultural life without stigma. In a state of nature, there is nothing preventing people from engaging in homosexual relationships. No inherent force dictating that love or attraction must follow rigid binary norms. It only becomes a problem when centralized states or organized religion impose artificial restrictions criminalizing what was once accepted. Homophobia, then, is not an organic product of African culture, but a product of being civilized. As African societies became more structured under colonial rule, European institutions imposed their rigid moral codes, using religion and law to enforce obedience and eliminate social autonomy. The philosopher Jean Jacques Rousseau argued that humans are most virtuous when they follow their natural impulses, but civilization corrupts them, leading to inequality, repression, and moral decay. In his concept of the noble savage, Rousseau suggested that so called civilization does not make people better, it makes them more degenerate. African societies in a pre colonial state reflected this truth. They were freer, more accepting, and less burdened by the oppressive moral dictates of centralized power. It was only through the violence of colonization and forced civilization that intolerance and repression took root, distorting what was once a far more liberated way of life. Colonial narratives painted pre colonial Africa as uniformly patriarchal, heterosexual, and intolerant of sexual diversity. This was not just historically inaccurate, it was a deliberate attempt to erase indigenous practices that contradicted European morality. Anthropological evidence from across the continent tells a very different story. The Bafia of Cameroon, among the Bafia of Cameroon, homosexual relationships were part of rites of passage for young men. These relations were seen as a natural part of male bonding and social development. I want you to understand that that is. I don't want to go off on tangent, but yeah, that it happens in the animal kingdom also that they do engage in same sex relations. It's part of the bonding rituals. And quite as it's capped, even straight boys, they're not going to admit this, but they've done stuff when they were little. I mean, I know this from my own experience growing up as a black boy. These people were not necessarily gay, but they did shit. They did shit. We all y'all know what I'm talking about. What little boys do. I'm not even going to go there because I think it's completely self evident. You all know what little boys do during their experimentation phase. These relations were seen as a natural part of male bonding and social development, not as a threat to the societal order. They existed alongside heterosexual relationships without conflict or stigma. The Maasai of East Africa, known for their warrior traditions, also had practices of same-sex intimacy with age-set groups. Young warriors often formed close bonds that included both emotional and physical intimacy. These relationships strengthened communal ties and reinforced solidarity among peers. Yoruba spiritual traditions acknowledge gender fluidity through the roles assigned to priests and priestesses of certain orishas. The orisha, oh gosh, I'm not even going to try to read that word, associated with purity and creation was often served by priests who defied conventional gender norms. Same sex relationships were also present in royal courts and spiritual communities where they were viewed through the lens of companionship and devotion rather than sin. The Igbo of Nigeria, among the Igbo, the practice of female husbands disrupted Western notions of gender and sexuality. A woman could marry another woman, often to preserve family lineage or economic stability. Right, this is another thing they don't know. In African societies, property was not always passed down to the male. Property could actually be passed down to the female. And I know we weren't big on capitalism, but it could just be your livestock. It could just, I mean, basically, yes, the lineage did not always pass down to the male. Royal, even royal titles did not always pass down to the male. They could be passed down to the female. In many pre-colonial African societies, queerness was not just tolerated; it was often seen as spiritually significant. Gender non-conforming individuals were frequently assigned special roles with the communities, serving as healers, diviners, and intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Their perceived ability to navigate both masculine and feminine energies made them valuable community members rather than outcasts. I have all these words that I can't even pronounce. For example, among the Dagara people of Burkina Faso, individuals who did not conform to gender norms were believed to possess unique spiritual insight. They often served as gatekeepers, mediating between the community and the spirit world. Similarly, the Wanji of Uganda recognized gender nonconforming individuals as possessing special powers of uh, divination and healing. These practices were not isolated anomalies. They were part of broader cultural frameworks that embraced diversity as a strength rather than as a threat. Queerness was integrated into community life, tied to sacred duties, social roles, and kinship networks. The arrival of European colonizers upended these social structures. Colonial administrators imposed centralized state systems modeled after European governance, replacing kinship based communities with colonial bureaucracies. These new systems prioritize conformity, hierarchy, and control, values that were fundamentally at odds with the social fluidity that had defined many African societies. Colonizers introduced strict gender binaries as part of their broader mission to civilize African people. They viewed African gender and sexual diversity as evidence of barbarism, using this perceived moral inferiority to justify conquest and domination through colonial education system, missionary activities, and legal frameworks. They imposed European norms on African societies, recasting indigenous practices as sinful, backward, and criminal. Anti-sodomy laws introduced by British and French colonial governments became powerful tools for social control. These laws didn't just punish same-sex intimacy, they fractured communities by teaching Africans to police each other. Colonial administrators knew that internal division would make resistance to colonial rule more difficult, and homophobia proved to be an effective weapon for achieving that goal. Perhaps the most tragic legacy of colonialism is the loss of cultural memory. European colonizers didn't just outlaw same sex relationships and gender nonconformity, they erased the historical record of these practices. Indigenous oral traditions were dismissed as folklore, while African anthropologists documented African societies through a Eurocentric lens, often ignoring or misrepresenting queer practices. Generations of Africans grew up under colonial rule, taught to see queerness as foreign and sinful. The vibrant histories of queer Africans, their contributions to culture, spirituality, and community were buried beneath colonial narratives. Today, when African leaders claim that homosexuality is un African, they are not speaking from historical truth, but from colonial propaganda that has been passed down for generations. Reclaiming this history is an act of resistance. It is a reminder that Black queer people are not outsiders in their own communities, but heirs to a rich cultural legacy that predates uh, colonialism by centuries. Homophobia, not queerness, is the foreign import, the true weapon of white supremacy. The arrival of Abrahamic religions, Christianity, and Islam marked a turning point in how African societies viewed gender and sexuality. Before colonization, African spiritual systems were diverse and often accommodating of queerness. But as European missionaries and Arab traders spread their faith across the continent, they introduced rigid moral frameworks that cast same-sex relationships and gender nonconformity as sinful. Christian missionaries, working hand in hand with colonial administrators, framed their mission as one of salvation. They didn't just aim to convert Africans to Christianity, they aimed to erase African cultural practices and replace them with European norms. This cultural genocide extended to sexuality. The Christian doctrine they preached was not about liberation but about control, reinforcing the colonial agenda by demonizing anything that didn't align with African patriarchal values. Similarly, the spread of Islam, particularly through trade routes in West and East Africa, brought with it interpretations of Sharia law that condemn same sex intimacy. While pre Islamic African societies often embrace fluid understanding of gender and sexuality, the adoption of religious frameworks rooted in Middle Eastern patriarchy shifted societal attitudes. These frameworks prioritize heterosexual patriarchal family structures as the foundation of moral and social order. Religious conversion didn't just change spiritual practices, it sparked a moral panic around sexuality. European missionaries and Islamic scholars framed same sex intimacy and gender nonconformity as threats to societal stability and moral purity. This this fear mongering wasn't just about theology, it was about power. By portraying queerness as sinful, religious authorities aligned themselves with colonial powers, reinforcing systems of control that extended from the church to the state. The Bible and the Quran were weaponized to justify oppression. African practices that had once been integrated into community life were now framed as evidence of heathenism and backwardness. Missionary schools reinforced these messages, teaching African children to equate queerness with sin and Western heteronormativity with civilization. The indoctrination had lasting effects. As African societies converted to Christianity and Islam, they internalized the belief that queerness was not only immoral but foreign. Colonial propaganda framed same sex relationships as a Western perversion, even though the true Western import was homophobia itself. The contradiction persists today, with many African leaders and religious figures condemning homosexuality as un African despite overwhelming historical evidence to the contrary. The tragedy of religious colonialism is not just the imposition of foreign ideologies, but the way those ideologies became embedded in African cultural identity. Over generations, the line between indigenous beliefs and colonial propaganda became blurred. Homophobia, once an alien concept, became accepted as tradition, while queerness was recast as a foreign threat. This internalized oppression manifests in countless ways. Black parents taught by colonial era churches and schools pass down anti gay beliefs to their children, believing they are protecting them from moral corruption. Religious leaders Religious leaders trained in Western theological frameworks preach sermons that condemn queerness while ignoring the colonial origins of their doctrine. Politicians seeking to assert an authentic African identity champion anti gay legislation without realizing they are reinforcing colonial values. The physical presence of European colonizers may have ended with the wave of African independence movements around the mid 20th century, but the legal, cultural, and social frameworks they impose remain deeply embedded. Nowhere is this more evident than in the continued enforcement of colonial era anti sodomy laws. These laws, originally crafted by British and French colonial administrators, were never rooted in African cultural practices. They were imported tools of control designed to enforce European notions of morality. When African nations gained independence, many of them retained colonial penal codes without question. The British Empire, in particular, left behind a trail of anti gay legislation in its former colonies, from Nigeria to Kenya, Uganda, and Ghana. These laws didn't reflect indigenous values, they reflected Victorian era Christian morality codified into colonial law books and passed down like a curse. In Nigeria, Section 214 of the Criminal Code, which criminalizes same sex relationships, is a direct holdover from British colonial rule. Uganda's infamous Anti Homosexuality Act, though passed in 2014, was built upon colonial era sodomy laws. Across the continent, similar laws remain on the books, not because they are authentically African, but because the colonial system that introduced them were never fully dismantled. What's more insidious is how these laws have been reframed as defenders of African culture. Politicians and religious leaders Politicians and religious leaders, often educated in Western schools and steeped in colonial ideologies, champion anti gay legislation as a way to assert cultural authenticity. In doing so, they unknowingly or perhaps knowingly reinforce the very colonial structures they claim to resist. In the post-colonial era, African leaders faced the daunting task of rebuilding national identities after decades, sometimes centuries of colonial domination. Unfortunately, many turned to cultural nationalism as a strategy, emphasizing conservative social values as a way to distinguish African identity from Western influence. Homophobia became a convenient tool in this process. Leaders like Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe or Yo Wilvi, oh gosh, these names, of Uganda positioned themselves as defenders of African culture, using anti gay rhetoric to rally nationalist sentiment. Mugabe famously called homosexuality un African, claiming it was a Western import meant to corrupt African societies. The myth that homosexuality is a Western import has become one of the most powerful justifications for contemporary African homophobia. This narrative, repeated by politicians, religious leaders, and community elders, frames queerness as a foreign threat to African culture imposed by Western media, NGOs, and human rights organizations. But history tells a different story, as we've already explored same sex relationships, gender fluidity, and non-binary identities existed across pre-colonial Africa, from the female husbands of the Igbo to warrior bonds of the Samburu. African societies embraced sexual and gender diversity long before European colonizers arrived. The true Western import was not homosexuality but homophobia. Today, when African leaders claim to defend cultural purity by opposing LGBTQ rights, they are not rejecting Western influence. They are upholding it. They are enforcing colonial laws, preaching colonial morality, and perpetuating the colonial violence against their own people. I'm trying to see how much I should skip. Okay. I'll do a little bit more, then I'm just see if there are there any comments. The path to liberation begins with truth telling. Homophobia in black communities is not an organic African virus. It is a um, colonial weapon. European missionaries and colonial administrators imposed anti-gay ideologies under the guise of civilizing African societies, using religion, law, and education to recast queerness as foreign and sinful. Breaking free from this colonial legacy requires more than legal reform. It demands a cultural reckoning. We must unlearn the false histories imposed upon us and reclaim the indigenous traditions that honor and accepted sexual and gender diversity. This work is already being done by African scholars, activists, and cultural leaders who are challenging anti gay narratives and documenting the histories that colonizers sought to erase. But this movement is not just academic, it's deeply personal. For Black queer people, reclaiming our history means reclaiming our humanity. It means refusing to accept the lie that we are foreign to our own cultures. It means demanding full inclusion within our families, communities, and nations, not as Western imports, but as rightful heirs to African traditions of diversity and resilience. When African leaders, pastors, or elders claim that homosexuality is un-African, they are not defending cultural authenticity. They are upholding colonial ideology. True African identity is far more complex and diverse than the narrow frameworks imposed by European colonizers. Liberation is not just about dismantling oppressive systems, it's about building inclusive communities where all Black people, including queer people, can live with dignity, safety, and joy. This work begins at home within our communities, churches, and families. It requires us to confront the internalized homophobia that has been passed down through generations and to replace it with love, understanding, and historical truth. For Black parents, it means teaching children that queerness is not foreign, but part of our shared cultural heritage. For religious leaders, it means challenging the colonial interpretations of Scripture that have been used to justify exclusion and harm. For policymakers, it means repealing colonial era sodomy laws and enacting protections for LGBT plus people. And for Black queer people ourselves, it means reclaiming our place within our communities, not as outsiders, but as rightful heirs to African traditions of resilience, creativity, and love. It means rejecting shame and embracing pride, knowing that our existence is not a deviation from Blackness, but an integral part of it. The struggle against homophobia is inseparable from the broader struggle for Black liberation. Both forms of oppression are rooted in the same colonial systems that sought to control African bodies, minds, and identities. To dismantle one, we must dismantle the other. True liberation requires us to break the chains of colonial morality and reclaim the cultural practices that once embraced us in all our diversity. It requires us to build communities that celebrate rather than punish difference. And it demands that we stand together in Africa, in the diaspora, and across the globe, united in a fight for justice, dignity, and freedom. Homophobia was never ours. It was given to us by colonizers who sought to divide and control us. Reclaiming our history, embracing our truth, and standing in solidarity with one another is how we break the cycle of oppression and move toward true liberation. We are not foreign. We are not unnatural. We are not broken. We are here as we have always been, resilient, proud, and unapologetically Black and queer. Our liberation is intertwined with the liberation of all Black people, and together we will build a future where love, not hate, defines our communities. All right, y'all. I do have some comments. I know people don't know this stuff, but you guys need to research your history. Hey, Guru. Yeah, well, hopefully, I'm still trying to decide if I want to start my own church. It's going to take a lot of work, but we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, I mentioned that the other day. Paragraph 170. Wait a minute. Yeah, I believe it's paragraph 175 because um I recently talked about that. The pink triangles, how they rounded up all the gay people and put them in concentration camps. Um, Unfortunately, we're at the end of Pride Month, so I don't really have a whole lot of time to talk about that. But yeah, there's some interesting history about that too, about what led up to that. But it's all rooted in Christianity and religion. Not just Abrahamic religions, because Judaism was a part of it too. So it's not just Christianity. It's Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Right. But the I guess the problem is that they're trying to put people in boxes in the first place. I don't think that people necessarily had an identity before. They just did whatever they wanted to do. If they found somebody attractive, then they would express how they felt about them. They would be in a relationship, have sex, or whatever. There was never a gay or a bisexual labels put on someone. They just did it. Now it's like, okay, you have sex with a man, okay, you're gay, and that you basically can't. I know a lot of people don't really believe there's a such thing as being bisexual. That you're just a gay man who's in the closet. So anyway, yeah, I'll read this last comment. Let us even argue that most people are not hetero, but performatively hetero, as they were not before, but as but now are, and then projecting that everywhere over time, attempting to justify it 24/7. Yes, the Kinsey scale actually demonstrated that it is a scale. Most people who claim that they're entirely one way or the other are not. Even though I identify as a gay man, I'm going to admit that in the past there were women. I mean, let me be more accurate. There were girls who I was attracted to when I was a little boy. There were girls who I was attracted to. I don't know that it was necessarily a sexual attraction. I don't know. I think because of shit that I went through, it just went. I don't know. I guess I'll leave that alone because I don't want to start a broader conversation that probably needs more explanation. But I do think that the community does have a role, and I'm going to get to that. I do before the end of the month. I do want to read chapter 5, where I talk about the man is the prize, how the community plays a role in pushing homosexuality onto Black boys. But for now, I'm going to end this live stream. So be sure to post some comments and let me know what you think. And I don't know. I'll try to get through as much I probably only have time for one more chapter, but I appreciate your support.